The Marvel Cinematic Universe has come a long way since director Jon Favreau introduced it to audiences with 2008's Iron Man, a film that marked the beginning of what would go on to become the biggest franchise in the history of cinema. Of course, after Marvel concluded its Infinity Saga with Avengers Endgame, they didn't just want to stop there. And thus, the Multiverse Saga began. Say what you will about the Multiverse Saga, it's hard to deny it's the most experimental Marvel has been with its projects since the MCU's early days, and few MCU installments represent that more than WandaVision. Released in 2021, WandaVision had a lot of weight on its shoulders. It was the first Marvel project to release in 2021 after the MCU's hiatus during the COVID-19 pandemic. It was also Marvel's first attempt at a TV show set in the MCU since the Netflix Marvel collaboration, starring two Avengers, and it was taking an experimental approach as opposed to the traditional MCU formula. However, despite all the pressure, WandaVision was not only well received by critics and audiences, but was generally considered one of the best Disney Plus offerings from Marvel and one of the better installments of the Multiverse Saga. So how does it hold up now? An immediate draw of the show is the fact that it is a loving homage to television history, mainly sitcoms. The first 3 episodes particularly resemble old sitcoms like The Dick Van Dyke Show. The appreciation for sitcoms of that time is very apparent. For example, much of the first episode is shot from one angle. It's presented in black and white, and of course, there's a laugh track. However, amidst the sitcom aesthetic is a compelling mystery. There's points in the first 3 episodes where something strange would happen, the camera work would become more cinematic with the introduction of dolly shots. The mystery overall does work. The deliberately slow pacing of the first 3 episodes allows the mystery to develop in a natural way that never gives you immediate answers. The show does a fantastic job at getting you hooked in this bizarre scenario that Wanda and Vision find themselves in, because weird things are happening and there aren't a whole lot of answers at first, which was ludicrously enthralling. Then there's the sitcom element, which makes up a pretty large majority of the show. This was easily the biggest risk because while comedy was a consistent element of Marvel films up to this point, doing a sitcom is the furthest they'd gone down the comedy route, and it's also a huge stylistic shakeup for Marvel. Luckily, it really pays off, because for one, it never feels like it's trying to recreate anything. It's very much a loving tribute to the sitcom genre, but it still feels like its own unique take on it, with each episode representing a different era of sitcoms. While none of the comedy ever made me cry with laughter, the jokes do consistently land for me, and I found many of the comedic routines to be very entertaining, particularly one in episode 2 wherein Vision gets some gum stuck in his gears during a magic show, and Wanda has to use her powers to conceal Vision's powers from the audience, whilst also concealing her own. On that note, I like the way the show presents Wanda and Vision's powers in older eras of TV. In each episode they use different special effects to show their powers depending on what era of TV the episode is built around. And in episode 6, which is one of my favourites, it even results in delightfully cheap Halloween costume versions of their actual superhero costumes. Having each episode be a homage to a different era of sitcom is a genius way to give the show variety. It ensures that every episode feels unique from the last, even though they're all parts of the same story. It gives the show a visual distinction that few Marvel movies and shows have. One difficult task this show had for me personally was getting me invested in these characters, because Wanda and Vision were never really characters I got into that much. I didn't dislike them, but I was never that invested in their romance, and I always felt they were kind of overshadowed by the other characters they shared the screen with. But this show really made me come around on them, because right off the bat, this show, if anything, is a great showcase for Elizabeth Olsen and Paul Bettany. They are incredible in this series, especially Elizabeth Olsen as Wanda, and this is one of the only MCU installments with a romance that is deeply layered. In her grief, Wanda has ensnared this town inside a hex, in which she uses her abilities to control the town's residents against their will and alter reality within the town to create a sitcom that's being broadcast to people on the outside. In doing so, she also creates a new Vision to cope with all the tragedies she has experienced throughout her life, losing her parents, brother, and eventually her lover. It's also revealed in episode 8 that Wanda and her family had a tradition of watching American sitcoms together every night. The fact the sitcom aesthetic has narrative and emotional significance to Wanda is a wonderful idea. It adds an emotional layer to the sitcom element of the show because American sitcoms are Wanda's last link to her family. It imbues the sitcom element with more meaning and emotional significance beyond being a stylistic vessel for the show's mystery. Her grief literally manifests into an ideal alternate reality where she has everything she could ever want want, a husband and 2 children to call family. But there's a layer of tragedy to all of this because none of what she's created is real. It's all an illusion, which makes it incredibly sad when this reality starts falling apart around her as her grief worsens and she begins to lose control. Even so, this show smartly doesn't shy away from showing how horrible it is for the people of Westview to be under her control. There's a chilling sequence where Vision ventures closer to the borders of the Hex, where we see that people can't even move unless Wanda allows them to, and it's horrifying. I like seeing Wanda take a villainous turn and watching her grapple with the denial of what she's done, yet I think it's really impressive that this show is still able to make you sympathize with Wanda in spite of the fact that she has essentially enslaved this entire town. The Vision that we're seeing here is also intriguing because he's not the real Vision, because that Vision died in Infinity War. Nonetheless, he is still a great character in this show because, like the Vision from before, he loves Wanda dearly. But even though he was created by Wanda, he still has more control over himself than most people in Westview, so he becomes more aware of what's going on around him. I love that Wanda's actions begin to form a wedge between her and Vision. The argument scene in episode 5 is my favourite scene in the series because it's pretty endearing seeing Vision push back against Wanda as he starts to realise all the messed up shit she is doing. But despite the conflict between the two of them, both characters are incredibly likeable throughout, and you really begin to care for them as the series progresses and want them to be happy. Their romance is still believable and worth rooting for, even when there is friction between them, because there is always an underlying sense that they care for one another. I will even go as far as to say that Wanda and Vision's romance in this show is the best on-screen romance the MCU has ever had. All that being said, this show is great until it has to be an MCU show. The Marvel formula has resulted in some of the greatest triumphs of the comic book movie genre, but a problem I have had with a lot of Marvel shows and movies post-Avengers Endgame is that they feel bound by the weight of existing within the MCU, and I think that is definitely true in the case of WandaVision. While all of the stuff going on with Wanda and Vision is for the most part great, a lot of the stuff outside of that just isn't up to the same standard. Outside of Westview is an organization called SWORD, this show's stand-in for S.H.I.E.L.D., who, with the help of Monica Rambeau, Jimmy Woo, and Darcy Lewis, are trying to break into Westview to save the residents from Wanda's control. Now, I will give the SWORD sequences this: they are made watchable by the presence of Teyonah Parris, Randall Park, and Kat Dennings, all of which are great. As this show did with Wanda and Vision, they took characters that I previously didn't think much of, in some cases found rather irritating in the case of Darcy Lewis, and made them very likable. I never liked the character of Darcy Lewis in the Thor movies, but she feels right at home in this show and was actually a very entertaining presence. As a bonus, through the character of Monica Rambeau, we're able to see a more grounded perspective of how the world reacted to the Thanos snap being undone, in a harrowing scene where Monica returns after being erased from existence in a blip, only to discover her mother, whom she was sat next to in a hospital when she blipped, has been dead for years. Seeing people get brought back to life and the chaos that ensued is fascinating, and I loved seeing a very grounded perspective of that event. It also laid the groundwork for Monica's arc in the show, which was one of the better parts of the SWORD scenes. But as fun as these characters are, they don't save the SWORD subplot from being as generically formulaic as it is. A lot of the time, the SWORD scenes are just there to provide exposition to explain what's going on. But honestly, the show didn't need that at all. I would argue the story would be more compelling if this series fully committed to taking the audience on a wild, trippy ride through televisual history that encouraged asking questions and fed intrigue, instead of having scenes with SWORD agents explaining what's happening, because it discourages intrigue, which discourages speculation, which are things a show like WandaVision needs to thrive on. Then there's the villains. I'll start with Josh Stamberg as Hayward. Hayward doesn't ever go beyond the shady government official type. In fact, he doesn't even seem to have any motivations. We know he's trying to get into the Hex because he wants to use Vision as a weapon, but we never find out why. Stamberg does what he can, but unfortunately it's a thankless and utterly forgettable role. And of course there's Agatha Harkness, played by Kathryn Hahn. On the one hand, I get and even agree with the argument that the show perhaps would have been better with no villain other than Wanda herself. On the other hand, Kathryn Hahn is amazing in this show. Her transformation from nosy neighbor to creepy witch is effective, especially on rewatch, as all the ways in which she manipulates Wanda and Vision become clearer. Her time in full-on villainy is short, but Kathryn Hahn gives it her all, and she makes for an excellent antagonist, and good lord, that song is catchy. Although my biggest issue that has always disappointed me regarding this show is the finale. For me, it is fairly underwhelming when a show that is as creative, experimental, and unique unique as WandaVision, ends with a standard MCU superhero brawl. You have Wanda fighting Agatha, Vision fighting another Vision, and their kids fighting sword agents, and while it was still entertaining and the fights are actually pretty well done, it just feels like the show loses its identity and becomes a more traditional MCU outing at the last minute. I mean, they're both fighting villains with similar power sets, which is something we've seen many times in the MCU as well as the comic book genre as a whole, and it isn't any more interesting than it was prior. I'll admit, I am a sucker for the Marvel formula, especially when it's done well, but even an MCU show like WandaVision shouldn't fall back on that. When this show is allowed freedom from the formula and continuity restrictions of the MCU, that is WandaVision at its best. Whenever the show has to be an MCU property with scenes and an entire episode focusing on the sword agents explaining what's happening, a poorly developed villain, and end with a big battle like you would normally get in your average MCU installment, that's where the show starts to lose me. It should have ended in a fashion that is representative of what the show was trying to be, as opposed to another MCU property. I do, however, adore the scene where Wanda decides to let Westview go and free everyone from the Hex. The moment where she lets go of her kids and Vision is just heartbreaking. On rewatch, I did get emotional when she thanks her kids for choosing her to be their mom, and her final goodbye to Vision was so beautifully tragic. I do love the tragedy that by letting Westview go, Wanda must also let her family go. Yet there is something about the finale that I have always felt conflicted about. So after Wanda lets her family go, she's walking away and the people of Westview are glaring at her and are understandably very pissed off at her for enslaving them. But then Monica Rambeau says to her they'll never know what you sacrificed for them. And that just seemed off to me because Wanda essentially enslaved this entire town and did some pretty horrific things in this show. What's more, she also obtains a whole bunch of new powers and abilities as well as a cool new costume. It never feels like she suffers any real repercussions for her actions. And yes, she loses Vision and her kids, but much like the sitcom reality she created, they weren't real. They literally did not exist. So Wanda essentially loses nothing for doing all the horrible things she did, and is literally rewarded with the Darkhold and a new costume. Again, I'm all for having a villainous character that you can feel sympathy for, especially in the case of Wanda, and for the most part this show does a really good job at that, but this is a little too far in that direction for me. Still, regardless of my problems, I can't deny I really like the majority of this show. I think it's the MCU's best utilization of Wanda and Vision. I love the direction it took those characters and their romance, and experimenting with the sitcom motif and linking it to Wanda's past trauma is genius. Do I wish the show had stuck to its guns and gone full speed ahead with its experimental ideas and sitcom motif? Hell yes. But despite its flaws, WandaVision is a unique experience and one of the boldest, most original and creative endeavors of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It's nowhere near perfect, but it's one of Marvel's most fascinating experiments.